Okay, Iran is begging for a deal. That's the claim made by US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Just hours later, he warned that if Tehran refuses, they will pay the price. It's one of the strongest public statements to come from Washington since this crisis began. But here's the question almost nobody is asking. Is Iran really asking for negotiations? Or is Washington trying to shape the narrative before the next phase of this conflict begins? Because when governments start making bold public declarations during a war, history shows those words often matter just as much as the missiles. And if Rubio's statement is more than diplomatic pressure, then the next move in this conflict may already be underway. All right, everyone believes the world's biggest crisis is about Iran's nuclear program. But what if that's no longer the real story? What if the nuclear issue has already become secondary, and the real battle is now over something far more dangerous? Something that could determine the future of the global economy itself? Just hours ago, a former senior US diplomat made a remarkable admission. He argued that President Trump is no longer chasing just a nuclear agreement. He now faces a much bigger challenge, one that even experienced diplomats describe as a very, very tall order. Because this is no longer simply about centrifuges, uranium, or sanctions. It's about the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which a significant share of the world's energy supply passes every single day. If diplomacy fails there, the consequences won't stop in Tehran, Washington, or the Gulf. They could reach every fuel station, every supermarket, every shipping company, every investment portfolio, and every household connected to the global economy. And then, something happened that made this story even more complicated. While Washington continued warning that Iran's nuclear ambitions must be contained, the United States quietly signed a landmark civilian nuclear cooperation agreement with Saudi Arabia, a deal worth billions of dollars, a deal designed to bring American nuclear technology into the kingdom for decades. A deal both governments described as a major step toward deeper strategic cooperation in the Middle East. And suddenly, a new question emerged. If preventing nuclear proliferation is the central objective, why expand nuclear cooperation elsewhere in the region at precisely the moment tensions with Iran are reaching their highest point in years? Supporters argue the answer is simple. Strengthen trusted allies. Maintain American influence. Keep regional nuclear development under internationally supervised standards. Critics, however, see something much bigger taking shape. Not just another diplomatic agreement, but the beginning of an entirely new balance of power across the Middle East. And if that's true, then this crisis is no longer just about Iran. It's about who will shape the region's future for the next generation. Has the real objective of this conflict quietly changed while the world was still focused on nuclear headlines? Because if that's true, everything you've heard over the past few weeks may only be the opening chapter of a much larger geopolitical confrontation. And before this video ends, you may look at every new headline from the Middle East very differently. And then, another development made the picture even more complicated. Inside Washington, officials were describing the conflict as necessary. But outside the White House, many Americans were asking a very different question. Recent polling suggests that fewer than 1 in 3 Americans support the war with Iran. Support appears to be declining as fuel prices rise, household costs increase, and lawmakers begin discussing tens of billions of dollars in additional military spending for a conflict that was originally presented as limited. The debate is no longer taking place only inside military command centers. It's happening around American kitchen tables. How long will this last? How much will it cost? And perhaps most importantly, who ultimately benefits if this confrontation keeps expanding? Now step back for just a moment. In the same week, Washington warns that Iran's nuclear ambitions must be contained. Signs a historic civilian nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia. Calls for billions more to finance an expanding military campaign, while support among ordinary Americans continues to fall. Those aren't isolated headlines. They're pieces of the same geopolitical puzzle. And once you put those pieces together, the story starts looking very different from the one most people are hearing. For the 12th consecutive night, the skies over Iran have been illuminated, not by the stars, but by the fiery trajectories of American munitions. while the explosions dominating the headlines paint a picture of a relentless military campaign, something far more complex and potentially more dangerous is unfolding behind the scenes. Oil markets are reacting with quiet panic. Diplomats are moving in the shadows. Intelligence agencies are issuing urgent, behind closed doors warnings. And Washington is sending a barrage of messages that, on the surface, appear to contradict one another. Why are the strikes continuing with such relentless intensity? Is the United States trying to force a reluctant adversary into negotiations? Or is it systematically dismantling the infrastructure of a nation it views as an existential threat? Why is Secretary of State Marco Rubio, standing thousands of miles away in Manila, suddenly talking about Iran's economic potential and claiming Tehran is begging for a deal? Why are American cybersecurity agencies warning of imminent digital attacks? And why is the State Department advising its citizens worldwide to exercise extreme caution? Is this escalating violence the chaotic prelude to a diplomatic breakthrough? Or is it merely the opening chapter of a much larger, uncontrollable regional confrontation? To understand the gravity of the current moment, we must look past the isolated headlines and examine the interconnected web of military, economic, and diplomatic actions that are currently reshaping the Middle East. The story of the 12th night of strikes is not just a story of bombs and targets. It is a story of a superpower testing the limits of its leverage and a regional power calculating the exact threshold of its survival. The latest physical manifestation of this pressure campaign occurred overnight at the Shalamsha border crossing. Located on the volatile frontier between Iran and Iraq, Shalamsha is not merely a line on a map, it is a vital artery. For millions of Shia pilgrims, it is the primary gateway to the holy cities of Iraq. For the regional economy, it is a crucial trade corridor. Yet, the passenger terminal was struck, leaving 2 dead and 11 injured, according to Iranian state media. But the targeting of Shalamsha was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader, coordinated pattern. In the southwestern province of Khuzestan, a storage facility in Avaz was hit. Iranian officials and local engineers argue that this site was targeted specifically to prevent the repair of civilian infrastructure. Khuzestan is the heartland of Iran's oil production, and Avaz is its capital. By striking storage and repair facilities, the military objective shifts from purely degrading offensive capabilities to crippling the logistical resilience of the state. Furthermore, for the second time in recent days, the northwestern region of Kermanshah was struck. This area is strategically vital. It borders Iraq and hosts significant Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC military installations. The strikes here suggest a dual objective: degrading the IRGC's cross-border logistical networks while simultaneously signaling to Baghdad that the border is no longer a safe sanctuary. Yet, the physical destruction on the ground is only half of the equation. The other half is playing out on the glowing screens of global financial markets. As the strikes entered their 12th night, the economic shockwaves began to materialize. Oil prices climbed steadily, with Brent crude futures surging past $96 a barrel, marking their highest level since early June. West Texas Intermediate followed suit, trading at over $88. This spike is not merely a reaction to the immediate loss of supply. It is a psychological pricing of risk. The market is not just reacting to the bombs falling in Avaz or Kermanshah. It is pricing in the potential for a broader closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the disruption of Iraqi oil exports, and the escalating attacks on commercial shipping by Houthi forces in the Red Sea. Every missile that falls in Iran adds a premium to the global cost of energy. And this economic pressure is precisely the lever Washington is attempting to pull. But that wasn't the only surprise emerging from the diplomatic front. While the bombs were falling in the Middle East, the diplomatic theater was shifting to Southeast Asia. Speaking on the sidelines of the ASEAN conference in Manila, Secretary of State Marco Rubio delivered a series of statements that offer a fascinating glimpse into the psychological warfare being waged alongside the kinetic one. Rubio declared that Iran can be the richest country in the Middle East, only to immediately pivot and accuse the nation's leadership of being radical clerics who are oblivious to economic realities. He argued that instead of building wealth, the regime funnels its resources to Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Shia militias, sponsoring terrorism across the globe. To understand why Rubio would make this specific argument at this precise moment, we have to look at the target audience. He is not just speaking to the Iranian people, he is speaking to the global South, to the ASEAN nations, and to the international community. By highlighting Iran's squandered economic potential, Washington is attempting to frame the conflict not as a war against the Iranian nation, but as a war against a regime that is holding its own people's prosperity hostage. It is a narrative designed to isolate the clerical establishment while leaving the door open for a post-conflict economic integration. However, Rubio's rhetoric took a much more aggressive turn when he addressed the possibility of negotiations. Iran is begging for a deal, he stated confidently, before immediately undercutting that claim by adding, "It looks like Iran is not ready to make a deal. They will pay the price." He emphasized that the primary focus of the United States remains a denuclearized Iran, warning of the catastrophic global implications if Tehran were to acquire a nuclear weapon. This creates a profound diplomatic paradox. On one hand, Washington claims the adversary is desperate to talk. On the other hand, it claims the adversary is not ready to talk and therefore must be punished. Intelligence analysts and regional diplomats are watching this contradiction closely. Is the assertion that Iran is begging for a deal based on hard intelligence from back-channel communications, or is it a rhetorical tactic designed to project strength and justify the ongoing military escalation? The evidence on the ground suggests that while Tehran may be feeling the pressure, its public and military posture is one of defiance, not capitulation. Meanwhile, behind the diplomatic headlines in Manila, a quiet but highly significant diplomatic maneuver was taking place in Baghdad. Iraqi Prime Minister Ali Faleh al-Zaidi departed for an official visit to the Iranian capital. The stated agenda includes natural gas cooperation and regional developments, but the subtext of this visit is far more critical. Iraq finds itself in an impossibly delicate position. It is a major ally of the United States, hosting tens of thousands of American troops, but it shares a massive, porous border with Iran and relies heavily on Iranian energy and political influence. By sending the Prime Minister to Tehran, Baghdad is attempting to act as a crucial buffer. The natural gas cooperation is a vital economic lifeline for Iraq's struggling electricity grid, but the regional developments on the agenda are a desperate attempt to de-escalate the cross-border strikes. If the U.S. continues to hit targets in Kermanshah and Shalamshah, Iraq's sovereignty and security are directly compromised. Al-Zaidi's visit is a high-stakes diplomatic effort to convince Tehran to restrain its proxies and convince Washington to limit its strikes, preventing Iraq from becoming the primary battleground for a wider war. Yet, as diplomacy struggles to gain traction, the military and intelligence dimensions of the conflict are expanding into new, invisible domains. Just as the physical strikes were dominating the news cycle, U.S. government agencies, including the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and the FBI, issued a stark, coordinated advisory. They warned American organizations of ongoing Iranian-affiliated cyber activity targeting internet-connected devices and critical infrastructure. This is not a routine warning. The involvement of the FBI's cyber division and the specific mention of imposing costs indicates that U.S. intelligence has detected a significant shift in Iranian cyber posture. Iranian cyber actors, often operating through sophisticated syndicates with alleged ties to state intelligence, are known for their ability to disrupt essential services. By issuing this public advisory, the U.S. government is doing two things. It is fortifying domestic defenses, but it is also signaling to Tehran that the U.S. is watching, and that any digital escalation will be met with a response. The cyber domain has become the silent front line of this conflict, where a single line of code can cause as much disruption as a physical strike on a power grid. This brings us to the broader, global implications of the escalation. The U.S. State Department renewed a sweeping security alert advising Americans worldwide to exercise increased caution. The language of the alert is notably severe. It explicitly notes that U.S. diplomatic facilities, including outside the Middle East, have been targeted. and warns that Iran and groups supportive of Iran may target other U.S. interests overseas. The advisory specifically highlights the potential for flight and travel disruptions, urging Americans to reconsider travel to and through the Middle East. This is a clear indication that Washington anticipates asymmetric retaliation. The U.S. military can dominate the skies over Iran, but it cannot protect every embassy, every commercial flight, and every business traveler around the globe from the reach of Iran's intelligence services and its network of regional proxies. The travel advisory is a quiet admission that while the U.S. holds the advantage in conventional warfare, the vulnerability of its global footprint remains a significant strategic liability. And what of the adversary's response? The Iranian military is not merely absorbing the strikes, it is actively recalibrating its doctrine. Brigadier General Amir Mohammad Akraminia, a spokesperson for Iran's army, issued a chilling warning. He stated that if U.S. attacks on southern infrastructure persist, Iran's security forces will implement new strategies and scenarios to make the war impossible for the aggressors to continue. Akraminia framed the current phase of the conflict as a direct result of what he described as the American violation of a memorandum of understanding. He stated that retaliatory strikes will continue as long as the infrastructure and coastal attacks persist. But what are these new strategies? Military analysts suggest this could mean a shift from limited, symbolic missile barrages to more sustained, coordinated attacks on U.S. naval assets in the Persian Gulf, or a massive escalation in the targeting of regional energy infrastructure. This threat was further contextualized by a direct message from the IRGC to the people of Kuwait. In a highly unusual public statement, the IRGC insisted that it is the United States, not Iran, that has violated Kuwaiti territorial integrity and sovereignty. The IRGC argued that its attacks are strictly aimed at U.S. bases. Territory it described as being beyond the control of Kuwait's own border guards, where Americans and their associates enter and leave freely. So it is America that has violated your territorial integrity and sovereignty, not us, the statement read. We are attacking lands occupied by the American army, an army that knows nothing but crime. This is a masterclass in psychological and diplomatic pressure. By addressing the Kuwaiti people directly, the IRGC is attempting to drive a wedge between the Gulf states' population and its government's security alignment with the United States. It is a warning shot across the bow of the Gulf Cooperation Council. The message is clear. If you allow the U.S. to use your soil to bomb Iran, you are complicit, and your sovereignty is an illusion. This rhetoric dramatically raises the stakes for Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, forcing them to weigh the cost of hosting American forces against the threat of Iranian retaliation. The physical reality of this escalation was further underscored by a report from the ISNA news agency, which detailed a U.S. attack in Iran's Hormozgan province. 2 naval search and rescue vessels were hit and seriously damaged. Targeting search and rescue assets is a highly controversial move in the laws of armed conflict, as it degrades the ability to save lives at sea. However, from a military perspective, it signals an intent to dominate the maritime domain completely, blinding the adversary and restricting their movement in the critical waters of the Persian Gulf. As we synthesize these disparate threads, the 12th night of physical strikes, the soaring oil prices, the contradictory diplomatic statements from Manila, the quiet diplomatic shuttle of the Iraqi Prime Minister, the looming cyber threats, the global travel warnings, and the IRGC's direct threats to Kuwait, a clear picture emerges. We are witnessing a multi-domain conflict where every action is designed to test the adversary's breaking point. The United States is employing a strategy of maximum pressure across all vectors: kinetic, economic, diplomatic, and digital. The objective is to degrade Iran's military capabilities while simultaneously fracturing the political will of the regime. Rubio's comments in Manila are the diplomatic face of this strategy, attempting to project inevitability and offer a narrative of future prosperity if the regime capitulates. Iran, conversely, is employing a strategy of strategic patience and asymmetric escalation. It is absorbing the physical blows while threatening to expand the war geographically and economically. The new strategies warned of by General Akraminia, combined with the IRGC's psychological messaging to Kuwait, indicate that Tehran is preparing to shift the battlefield from its own soil to the broader region, targeting the economic and security interests of the US and its Gulf allies. But this is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The real objective of this escalation may not be a total military victory, but rather the creation of a new, unfavorable status quo that forces a renegotiation of the regional order. The strikes on Avaz and Kermanshah degrade immediate capabilities, but the targeting of the Shalamsha crossing and the naval vessels in Hormozgan are designed to control the flow of trade and movement. To understand where this is heading, we have to look at what is not being said. The US is not publicly discussing the long-term governance of Iran, nor is it outlining a clear exit strategy for the military campaign. Iran is not publicly acknowledging the full extent of the damage to its infrastructure, nor is it detailing the specific new strategies it plans to deploy. Both sides are keeping their ultimate endgames hidden, relying on ambiguity to maintain deterrence. The economic consequences are already locking in. With oil pushing toward $100 a barrel, the global inflationary pressures are mounting. The shipping disruptions in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf are forcing supply chains to reroute, increasing costs and delaying deliveries. The cyber warnings suggest that the digital infrastructure of the West is bracing for impact. The travel advisories are a quiet acknowledgement that the war is no longer contained to the Middle East. It is a global security environment. As the sun rises over the Middle East, illuminating the dust, settling over the Shalamsha crossing, and the smoke rising from the storage facilities in Ahvaz, the world is left to grapple with the reality of this new phase of conflict. The bombs may eventually stop. The diplomacy may eventually resume. The oil prices may eventually stabilize. But after 12 consecutive nights of escalation, rising energy markets, urgent cyber warnings, frantic regional diplomacy, and conflicting political messages, one fundamental question remains entirely unanswered. Was this relentless pressure campaign the chaotic, violent catalyst needed to force a reluctant adversary to the negotiating table? Or was it merely the opening chapter of a much larger, uncontrollable confrontation that will redefine the global security architecture for decades to come? The calculations are being made in the Pentagon, in the IRGC command centers, in the diplomatic halls of Manila, and in the trading floors of London and New York. But as the clock ticks toward the 13th night, the only certainty is that the threshold of no return is rapidly approaching. Only the coming days will reveal the answer. The world is changing every day, and understanding it has never been more important. I quote, "I'll see you in the next video."